Mentioned a little earlier about a significant event that has taken place in Africa over many, many years. People who've been a part of this community have worked on it. This guy named Joseph Kony really has become one of the most infamous war criminals in the world. Abducting children, putting machine guns in their hands, asking them to go out and kill people their age, to kill their parents, brainwashing them, moving them to do the most violent and harsh and tragic things that no child should ever experience. Hundreds of thousands of people have died in this area of Africa due to this war that has constantly gone on. Well, Shannon Sedgwick Davis, who's been a part of Q, she spoke in 2009 in Austin prior to taking on this latest charge. But in her own right, has been a philanthropist, has led a foundation, has worked with IJM, has done a lot of things in her career, but there's a particular moment where a conviction and a calling just set in on her. And I want us to hear the story of what happens when this all of a sudden comes upon you. What are you supposed to do when you're busy, when you have a lot of other responsibilities? She most recently, a few weeks ago, published a best-selling book called To Stop a Warlord that tells this story. And I wanted to invite her back. I wanted her to share with us her story since she was last with us of what God's done in her life and how he's used her to just be a part of an unfolding story in the middle of Africa. So join me in welcoming Shannon Sedgwick Davis. Welcome. You're welcome. So Shannon, I've shared a little bit about this with everybody, but you had a lot going on, and then there was a moment where this tragedy that was taking place and unfolding and seemed to just never end in Africa was playing out. Why did you find yourself that you needed to get involved and take a more active approach than just donating money or getting somebody else to help? You decided to take an active role yourself.
Yeah, it really traces back to our foundation. I was CEO of the Bridgeway Foundation. We have a money management and mutual funds company that gives 50% of its profits to stop mass atrocity and genocide in the world. And in 2008, the LRA committed a series of Christmas massacres while people were off giving their Christmas prayers. And we looked at the grants that we had been giving in and around this issue area and saw that mass atrocity and really had to sort of look at ourselves in the mirror. And then in 2009, we had heard rumors that there would be a second Christmas massacre. And Christmas 2009 came and went. We thought no Christmas massacre, and I went up in March of 2010 to meet with a researcher that we had in the field. And she looked at me and she said, Shannon, actually, there was a Christmas massacre, and I've just found out about it, and I've just come back from collecting the evidence. It ultimately ran in the New York Times after that. But this idea that 321 people were killed again and another series of massacres, and that the world didn't know about it until 3 months later was deeply convicting, and it just felt like that was it. We either had to change our mission statement and say that we actually helped fund advocacy movements, or that we came in the aftermath of a mass atrocity. After the school was burned down, we gave funds to rebuild a school, which is incredibly worthy. Or we had to actually try and do what our mission statement said, which was to stop a mass atrocity, and that's what led to our intervention.
I know you wrote and have said before, I was tired of putting BandAids on bullet holes. How did that alter just your approach? And tell us more about the decision to say, we're gonna move beyond just fixing things after a crisis happens to try to getting into the prevention work.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, it absolutely just felt like that's what we were doing. We were coming in the aftermath and putting BandAids on bullet holes. And when you ask yourself, gosh, do we want to actually try to be a meaningful part of stopping a conflict? I think initially your first answer is, well, no. Like, that's a private foundation doesn't belong doing that, private individuals. But then when you actually start to spend time on the ground, and we did with our partners, and do a lot of listening, you'll find that the local community has all the solutions. There's oftentimes just a few gaps, and there was, in this case, a couple of gaps that we looked to fill. One was an early warning network, so a lot of these communities that were losing hundreds of lives, they didn't have cell phone towers, they didn't have radio towers, so sometimes a community would be attacked and then the LRA would move 20 kilometers and attack the next community. And so we were able to partner with a Catholic priest, Father Abbe Benoit, and help launch a radio network that now was available to actually give real-time information to villagers in terms of the LRA's movements. And then when you have that kind of information, you say, oh gosh, we know where they are, and we know how they're operating. You have to ask, gosh, is there something we can do about actually apprehension or bringing this to a close? And that's when we decided to fund trainers to train a special forces group within the Ugandan military as they were already pursuing the LRA. And that really was the unconventional part, I think, of our participation.
Yeah, and I know you were flying back and forth, leaving your home and your kids in Texas and showing up in the jungles of Africa and trying to live kind of this double life. That was probably hard to explain to your friends. And sometimes I think these leaders, they're called into these places where it's hard to, even at home, to know how to talk to the people you go to church with, or you're spending time with them, what God's called you to do and how you're doing it so strategically. Talk a little bit, though, about the people that you were training there and some of the unsung heroes. You mentioned a Catholic priest that was helping on some fronts. Are there some other people locally there that just stood out? I know in your book you talked about several.
Yes, so many of them. I mean, one of the most incredible partners we had along the way is a man named David Ochidi. And in our book, we chronicle his journey alongside the story. David was born the year the LRA started. And at age 16, the LRA came into his village and kidnapped all of those that were in his village, him and his brothers. And then they took him and put him to gunpoint and said, who do you love the most, your mother or your father? And David's response was, I can't answer that question. I love them both the same. And they forced him to answer who he loved the most, and he said his father, and his father was killed there in front of him. And wow. That is the depravity of humanity that the LRA represents. And David was kidnapped, went into the LRA for 6 months, bravely tried to escape and was successful in escaped alongside another boy that was with him, and that boy was not successful in escaping. And David has now come out, and the first thing, instead of going into deep grief, as one might expect, David said, no, I'm going to do everything in my power to stop this and help bring the rest of my brothers and sisters home. And so David does this incredible work that we've been so fortunate to help support. The LRA has broken into really small groups, and they're across a 90,000 square kilometer radius. And so at any given time, you've got little groups of LRA individuals with additional kidnapped individuals, and they might be being led by someone who was kidnapped at the age of 6 and is now 26 and is operating and leading this group. And so most of the time it's someone who obviously never intended to join the LRA or be a part of the LRA. And we might identify that in a certain region where there's this dense, triple canopy, thick jungle, that we think Sam Opio might be in that region. And so David will go back to the villages in Uganda and try to find Sam Opio's family, maybe a sister, maybe a mother, maybe an aunt, and record on his iPhone a message directly to them. Dwag Pacho, come home, my son. I've never stopped waiting for you. That's what one of the mothers has stated on the messages, which is so powerful. And then we'll plug them into these speakers that we have on our helicopter and hover over the region and just actually ask these individuals to come out. And the Ugandan military gave amnesty to anyone who wasn't a ICC indictee. And over that season, 730 walked out.
Wow, that is incredible. Awesome. You've said in your book, I've learned probably more from evil and suffering than anything else. What did that mean? Yeah, I'm so fortunate to grow up. I was a youth pastor's daughter growing up in Texas, and so incredibly fortunate to grow up in a safe and loving home. And I just feel like I was surrounded oftentimes by the concept of good a lot more than evil. And then my work led me to places where deep evil was occurring. What we just talked about, David's story. David is just one of thousands and thousands.
And I really had to wrestle with that. I had to wrestle with the idea that our God is a good and loving God, and that human beings are capable of that kind of evil. And in essence, my faith became much deeper because I wrestled with the entirety of it,
Right.
but different. For instance, joy. Joy was harder for me to come by than ever before. Growing up, I think I had rosy-colored glasses and just seemed to be able to sense and feel joy much easier. And after doing this work, I was lucky to be a part of a group called the Elders, which was founded by Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Tutu was the chairman of. And we were traveling in Darfur, and Arch, as I call him, we were in a refugee camp, and we were witnessing horrific things. And he was standing there, and I was watching him, and we were so sad. I mean, it was so horrific what we were witnessing. And he started to sing, and he started to dance. And then the rest of the community started to sing and dance. And this white girl had to try to sing and dance. And afterwards, when we were in our car on the way back to where we had set out from, I asked Arch, I said, Arch, what was that about? Like, you started singing and dancing in the midst of these people and them telling us these horrific stories. And he said, Shannon, I was crying inside. He said, joy has to be practiced. And joy is a discipline. And in thinking about joy that way and thinking about the promises,
Right.
I think, in the scriptures about joy, I think he's absolutely right. And so that's just another way I think that my faith has been transformed is in the practice of joy.